My name is Erin Flynn-Evans, and I direct the Fatigue Countermeasures Laboratory at NASA Ames Research Center. I'm a circadian physiologist, which means that I study the internal clock that controls when we sleep and when we wake up. And I've worked in sleep medicine for about 20 years. Well, I will tell you what a workday looked like before the pandemic. During the pandemic, I think my workday probably looks like many other people who are stuck at home and doing Zoom or WebEx meetings all day. Before the pandemic, I think my workday was pretty interesting. In my lab, we do a variety of research studies. So we study astronauts in space, and we also study pilots who are flying us around the country and around the world. And we study people in our research lab. And in order to study people in the lab and better understand how sleep affects our alertness and performance, we often have to work overnight. And so we'll bring people into our laboratory who volunteer to be part of our studies. We'll put electrodes on their head to measure their brain activity, and then we'll let them sleep in the lab, or sometimes we'll keep them awake and we'll give them lots of tests, and we'll measure how their brain responds to the different tests and things that we do. But that really changes how we work. We don't work typical schedules often, and we are often at work overnight. Yeah, so sleep touches everything. So, if you want to perform well, if you're a student and you want to perform well on a test, sleep is going to help you do that. If you are an athlete and you have to perform in a competition, sleep is going to give you a competitive edge. If you get enough sleep, you're going to live a longer and more healthy life. And so, sleep has both short-term immediate benefits, and it has long-term positive health consequences as well. Yes, daylight saving time is a really unfortunate construct that we have created. It's not unique to the United States. So daylight saving time is done in Europe, it's done in Australia, it's done in Canada. And while the original intent was to allow for longer, brighter summers, the reality is that at these 2 points every year where we change the clocks, we experience a circadian misalignment. And what that means is that our internal clocks become a little bit desynchronized from our social schedules. And so with the daylight savings transition that we just had, which a lot of people call spring ahead, we all actually had to shift our sleep schedules an hour earlier relative to normal. And that's really difficult, and probably more difficult than it seems when you just think about it. And what it really comes down to is the circadian rhythm, or your internal clock, promotes waking through the day. So as you go through the day, the circadian rhythm is really trying to keep you awake, because otherwise you would feel a very high sleep pressure. As you're awake, you have this other sleep drive that is just the buildup of sleep need over time. And the circadian rhythm is trying to counteract that to keep you awake to a regular time every day so that you can maintain alignment to the 24-hour schedule. However, when we do something like daylight savings time, where we have to shift the clocks earlier, often it means that you're going to have to go to bed during that time when you have this very strong drive to be awake. So even if you're very conscientious and you know that sleep is important and you really want to get your 8 hours, and you try to go to bed an hour earlier, you may find that you just lay there and you're not able to fall asleep at all. And then you get to morning and you have to wake up effectively an hour earlier to start your day, and you feel really groggy and have this heavy burden of what's called sleep inertia. And so this impact is not just seen on just the way we feel and losing a night of sleep. We see more accidents after the daylight savings time switch. We see more heart attacks after the daylight savings time switch. And so there are real world consequences to doing this switch every year. So much of the work that people in the sleep community are doing now is to advocate for eliminating this switch from daylight savings time to standard time every year, and just maintaining one time year round. Yeah, so Sleep is, and sleep and circadian rhythms are associated with many other aspects of biological function. So, for example, if you're not getting enough sleep on a regular basis, or if you are working overnight, you're much more likely to have cardiovascular problems. So, sleep loss is associated with a higher risk of cardiovascular disease and heart attacks and strokes. Sleep loss is also associated with impaired glucose clearance. So your insulin doesn't do as good a job at clearing that glucose. And so sleep loss and circadian misalignment are also associated with long-term risk of type 2 diabetes. And there are others too, like cancer. So working at night is associated with an increased risk of hormone-dependent cancers like breast and prostate cancer. So I would say in particular, this goes beyond daylight saving time. We know that students, particularly middle and high school students, have a later shifted circadian rhythm. And so that's biological wiring. Teens are just sort of geared to want to stay up later and sleep later. And so some people may have heard that there's a push for pushing school starts later by the American Academy of Sleep Medicine, for example. And that's largely driven by this understanding that teens have a later sleep shift. But even elementary school students could generally benefit from more sleep. We're seeing that every year, students are getting less sleep than they did in years prior. So really some key principles here are, do wind down activities in advance of a bedtime. So one, keep a bedtime. Think about, if you're a parent, think about how much sleep your child might need, assign a bedtime, and then try to allow your child to have plenty of time to get homework and other activities done before that bedtime so that they can have a nice wind down and ease into it. But for teenagers and older children who maybe are managing their own schedules a little bit more, it's also very helpful to be conscientious about this. And again, keep light out when you know you want to or should be sleeping. And then in the morning, exposure to bright light is actually really helpful and can help ensure that the next nights you're able to sleep when you're trying to go to bed, despite that natural, tendency for the body to want to shift later in the teenage years. That's a great question. So astronauts sleep much like we do on Earth. They are scheduled for 8.5 hours of sleep each night. And so, we want to make sure that they have enough opportunity to get enough sleep. And on the space station, we've worked really hard to make sure that their sleep environment is conducive to good quality sleep. So in some of our earlier missions, like on the space shuttle, there wasn't a whole lot of space. And so the astronauts had to sleep in hammocks and they could disrupt each other a little bit during sleep, because if you've ever been camping and slept in close proximity to other people, you've probably experienced that if somebody snores or rolls over, they might wake you up. But on the space station, we have much bigger space, and so we give the crew members these sleep quarters is what we call them. So they're like little phone booths, and they block out all the light that could come from the outside chambers in the in the ISS. And they block out sound. They have nice airflow, and they're just a nice little private space for the crew to sleep. They have sleeping bags in there that they can use, and they can also strap themselves to the wall, or they can free float. And in our conversations with crews, some people really like to be strapped down. They even strap a pillow to their heads, and some people do just kind of like to float around. Yeah, so I think it's an individual difference. So I've certainly heard both. Some crew members will say that they love sleeping in space, and some people will say that they prefer sleeping on the ground. So I think it's a personal preference. Yeah, so at NASA, we're probably a ways off for a Mars mission. Right now, we're really focused on heading toward the moon in 2024. But when we do eventually go to Mars, There are going to be a few challenges that are unique to that planet that we don't see on Earth. So for one, the rotation of Mars is 24 hours and 39 minutes, which means that the people who are living on Mars will have to, if they want to stay aligned to being awake during the solar day on Mars and asleep during the solar night, they're going to have to shift their sleep 39 minutes later than on Earth every day. And so that's going to potentially be challenging, because in order to adapt to a particular day length, you have to be exposed to light during the day. Our bodies are always looking for the light signal every day to set our internal clock and tell our bodies when it's time to be awake and when it's time to sleep. And so on Mars, the same will be true. But of course, unlike on Earth, astronauts who are working on Mars may not be able to spend as much time outside in natural light. And in fact, the photoperiod may not be sufficient to adapt them to that day length. And so we may have to send supplemental lighting, but that work is ongoing. Well, I think that STEM, it opens so many doors. So if you are interested in science, technology, engineering, or math, you have so many opportunities. So you may not even end up working in what one might think of as a traditional STEM field. For example, my work might not be considered a traditional STEM field, but it's full of discovery. Every day, I learn new things, either from the research that I do or from research that I read that others have done. And I find that really exciting. It means that I am exposed to new things, all the time. And that keeps me motivated and interested in what I'm doing. And I think that as children in K through 12, I think it is really important to have a passion, for your future career. And I think STEM provides a really exciting opportunity to follow your passion, whether it's sleep or whether it's, becoming an astronaut or whether it's building the next rocket. STEM is going to help in all of those fields.